Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7 here on Broadcasting Scotland. My name's Kenny McBride and I'm joined this evening by two excellent guests. Firstly, by journalist for The National and former MP, George Caravan. George, how are you doing this evening?
Good evening. I'm very well and happy to be on again.
Grand, well, it's great to have you. And on the other side of me, we have Allison Graham from the newly founded National Yes Network. Allison, how are you doing?
Doing very well, thanks very much, Kenny.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you, and we will be talking a wee bit about the National Yes Network later on. But we start this evening, as we always do, with our coronavirus statistics update. As of 2 p.m. today, a total of 1,149,140 people in Scotland have been tested through NHS Scotland labs and UK government regional testing centres. Of these, 1,058,179 were confirmed negative, 90,961 were positive. There were 818 new confirmed cases of COVID-19 in Scotland today, and sadly 44 new reported deaths. Of course, this will be an underestimate of the total number of cases, as not everyone with the virus will show symptoms and not everyone will necessarily get themselves tested. As always, we urge you, if you are showing symptoms of a fever, a new dry persistent cough, or a change in your sense of taste or smell, then please do book a test as soon as you can. Of the people who have tested positive, there were 1,161 people in hospital last night, 84 of whom were in intensive care. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection now stands at 3,588. This number only includes those who have died in hospital, having received a positive test for the virus. And the latest UK daily figures published today show that 56,533 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, an increase of 696 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings, not just those in hospitals. And we also have the latest from the National Records of Scotland. As at the 22nd of November, 5,380 deaths have been registered in Scotland, where the novel coronavirus was mentioned on the death certificate, according to statistics published by National Records of Scotland today. Between the 16th and 22nd of November, which was week 47 of the year, 244 deaths were registered which mentioned COVID-19 on the death certificate, representing a decrease of 35 deaths from the previous week. Of these, 207 had previously been announced in Scottish Government daily reporting. Over two-thirds of the people who died in the latest week were aged 75 and over. 14% were aged under 65. 49% of deaths were female and 51% were male. 160 deaths occurred in hospitals, 67 occurred in care homes, and 17 occurred at home or in another non-institutional setting. And to place these numbers in context, the provisional number of deaths from all causes registered in the week ending the 22nd of November was 1,357, 20% higher than the average over the previous 5 years. And before we go on to the rest of tonight's stories, if you would like to join in the conversation tonight, you can do so by following us on Twitter at BroadcastScot and using the hashtag Scotland at 7. As you can see, we'll be flashing some of these tweets up on the screen throughout the show, so do please get in touch if you've got anything to say about any of our stories tonight. Our top story: the Chancellor of the Exchequer today announced his annual spending review with the stated goal of building back better from the coronavirus crisis. Major announcements included a £100 billion investment in infrastructure over the coming year, which Sunak described as a once-in-a-generation investment, as well as a £4 billion levelling up fund for which communities throughout the UK may apply. The Chancellor also announced a pay freeze for most public sector workers and a cut to international aid, putting the UK's contributions below the international standard of 0.7% of GDP. Meanwhile, a festival of Brexit costing £29 million was also announced as part of a £120 million push to boost national pride and celebrate what it means to be British. Commenting, SNP Shadow Chancellor Allison MP said, "Yet again, Scotland has been completely ignored by Westminster. This failure will make the growing Tory unemployment crisis even worse, squeeze living standards even further, and risk a protracted downturn by starving the economy of funds. It shows yet again that Westminster cannot be trusted to act in Scotland's interests. The fact that Tories are wasting millions on a Brexit festival while slashing public sector pay and cutting support for the world's poorest tells you everything you need to know about this government's twisted priorities. Scotland has a right to determine our own future, so we can shake off this broken Westminster system and build a fairer country with independence. Oxfam, Save the Children and ActionAid UK all spoke out to condemn cuts to the international aid budget. Save the Children warned that the move is a hammer blow and criticised the UK government for choosing to balance the books on the backs of the world's poorest people. So, George, I think I'll come to you first on this one. So, putting your economist's hat on, what good moves did Rishi Sunak make today?
The answer to that is I'm not sure. I didn't see very many. Well, he has increased public expenditure in real terms a bit over what he was spending before for the rest of the year. That is until March. And he's clearly worried about the state of the economy. Every time you get a mini budget like this, you get a report from the Office for Budget Responsibility, which tells you how bad it's going to be. And today's report says employment is not going to recover until well into the end of the decade. So we're in even Sunak had to admit we're in serious economic trouble. So he's had to put a bit more extra money in. But two things to note. First of all, this only runs up until March. And I've had a little look at the numbers are always complicated. You have to, it takes a day or two to go through all the small print. But it does appear to me actually that the money tap starts to get turned off in March in the spring. And so what he might sound like he's Father Christmas at the moment, but that is about to end. The other thing to know is that where's this money coming from that he's spending? Well, he's not borrowing it. He keeps saying he's borrowing it. He's borrowing it in any sense from the Bank of England, but the Bank of England is owned by the government, and all the Bank of England is doing is printing the stuff electronically. So this is all funny money. So, when next year if you work in the public sector, your wages are frozen, and the Chancellor says your wages are frozen because I've got to pay back all this debt, you're being conned. The money isn't coming from somebody else, it's coming from the Chancellor's taking it out of one pocket, the Bank of England, and putting it in his other pocket. So I think that the wage freeze, the cut in foreign aid, these are just political acts to prove that the Chancellor has got right-wing muscle. He's playing to the Tory gallery. And frankly, I suspect he's looking beyond the present Prime Minister. When the present Prime Minister goes, I think the current Chancellor is looking to fill his place in number 10.
Now, you mentioned playing to the Tory gallery, but Lady Sugg, Foreign Office Minister in the Lords, her brief includes the sustainable development. She has resigned. She said that she couldn't live with this cut to international development budget. What does that tell you about what's going on in the Tory party?
Well, the reality is that the Tories put in their manifesto, which was last December, it's not that long ago, saying they would protect the 7% for foreign aid. So they've torn up yet another manifesto commitment. So are we seeing galaxies of Tory MPs in Scotland resigning over this? All the Tory MPs in Scotland stood on a manifesto, got elected on a manifesto of saying they would protect 7% spending, 0.7% spending on foreign aid. If they don't resign, it just shows how much trust you could put in their manifesto promises.
And Allison, coming to you now, we saw that quote from Save the Children talking about the government balancing the budget on the backs of the poorest people, but this cut to international aid only saves £4 billion compared to £29 million on a festival of Brexit. It's pretty small beer. And at the same time, we're seeing this freeze on a lot of public sector wages, which again is going to be a lot of quite poorly off people taking up most of the suffering to try and make this budget work in Tory terms. What do you make of that side of things, the where the cuts have come from versus where the big money is being spent?
Well, I think it's just typical of the kind of Tory, modus operandi that they go for these short-term things to make points, which I think the population's waking up to a lot of the myths around the kind of tax and spend, and more people, certainly in Scotland, are engaged in understanding more about where, as George said, who is it they're borrowing this money from. So it's political choices that they're making, and as you say, to pull money out of a festival for something that the polls are showing people are not even wanting, and certainly in the way that they voted in 2016, I think is just such a weird thing to kind of get your head around when people are told to tighten your belts. We're all in it together. I think fool me once with austerity, across the country, and communities are hurting. There's people with the kind of the level of support and the drip feed of the level of support. There's people who've got entrepreneurial skills, they've got small businesses that we're seeing that have never been on the benefit system, and who are now have no cash flow, and are really struggling to process that and to really work out what the future looks like for them, not just in the short term, but in the kind of longer term. And I think we need to start looking longer term at this. It's as George said, I think there's people who've got their eye on a career move rather than actually doing the job that they're in to do just now, to look and try and get the economy on a stable footing. The thing that I noticed about Sunak's announcements was there was a big elephant in the room of Brexit that wasn't really mentioned. Everything was very much about dealing with the crisis from the pandemic, but Brexit's coming at us like a truck, and I really think people are getting more and more scared about that and wondering exactly how that's going to hit them, particularly with the kind of perfect storm of people still trying to process what future looks like after COVID-19.
Well, we do move on now to a couple of Brexit stories. Contingency plans have been put in place by the Scottish Government to cope with the damaging effects of Brexit. Measures to mitigate the worst impacts of leaving the European Union on December the 31st will target support at health services, businesses and at-risk communities. With just 5 weeks to go to the end of the transition period, the UK Government and the EU are still in negotiations over the terms of Brexit, with both a no deal and low deal still on the table. The deal favoured by the UK Government and the prospect of no deal will see Scotland taken out of the single market and the customs union, and will mean the end of freedom of movement, negatively impacting jobs and living standards. Current concerns include the introduction of tariffs, shortages of medical supplies, and disruption to imports and exports from new border controls and customs restrictions. So there's a whole list of things here, Alison, that the Scottish Government is doing to try and help Scottish businesses to prepare for Brexit. But with so little time, with so little fiscal flexibility for the Scottish Government, it's really not possible for the Scottish Government to mitigate even a big chunk of the impact that businesses are going to feel, is it?
Yeah, and it's very difficult to predict exactly how it's going to impact different sectors. I think we've got a lot of predictions on the big things like food and farming, agriculture, like fishing, but there's still so many unknowns, and this to the wire is not really the way to run a country. And for Scottish Government to try and react to that without all the levers that they need to really deal with things, bearing in mind Scotland didn't vote for Brexit, it's very challenging, and it's very challenging for communities, and how we are going to support people through this. And I think that there's a recognition there that the Scottish Government, but it's like trying to work with your hands tied behind your back as to what is actually going to happen and what you can actually do within your gift. And I do think that's why a lot of people are starting to look at is independence now a less risky option for the first time for the risk averse amongst the population, because Brexit certainly seems like a kind of disempowered turn in the road. And I think, even though there's risk in any change, I think it seems to be a higher level of kind of hope in the vision now of independence. But it's a big challenge for the Scottish Government. It's a big challenge for communities and local authorities to try and, as I say, support everybody through this.
And for people that you're talking to, people in your area, people that you work with, whatever, are they feeling that Brexit is now kind of within sight, and are they starting to worry about it? Are business people that you talk to feeling that they're prepared?
Well, it's a bit like the COVID wave has hit. People are just trying to get their head up to the surface, and they see another big wave coming. And it's very hard to react when you're already trying to tread water. And I think that's the kind of general position people feel in. It's like, what it's just so much to cope with, given that, again, this is a political choice that's been made with Brexit, in the same way we spoke about the economy and the choices that are being made there. So it's very, I think there's just a very high degree of uncertainty and fear about what's coming. And I know certainly in rural communities, people will, pull together, and I think, across communities across Scotland to try and help. But there's only so much you can, crisis manage at the same time, particularly when you don't have all the kind of levers and lifeboats at your disposal to actually do anything really meaningful beyond your best endeavours. And I think there's a general sense of fear, I think, of what's coming next.
Well, George, to turn to you now, we are going to talk a wee bit about the negotiations in a moment, but what is it you think that's stopped the UK government from doing more mitigation work, more preparation work to make sure that there is some sort of smooth transition into whatever happens on January 1st? Is there some underlying motive you can think of that would explain the way they've gone about things?
Incompetence might be the best word. This whole Brexit thing has been a fantasy politics pushed basically by the libertarians in the Tory party, who just think, if only we were free, only Britain was free of all international connections, we could go back to the 19th century, we could trample the world, and we could do what we want. They really haven't thought it through. I mean, you'll remember that when Boris Johnson was reminded that business thought this might be a bad idea, he used a naughty word and said, well, to heck with business. I mean, they're really, it's an ideologically driven project. In as much as it's got any kind of economics behind it, it's quite interesting looking at the small print of today's budget statement, spending review statement. Way down the list, Sunak has been banging on again about his idea for free ports. He wants free ports. He wants to create 10 free ports where they'll take a zone around a port or an airport. They'll take away the taxes. They'll take away the regulation. They'll just turn it into a free-for-all and encourage investment. The idea behind the free port is to create a kind of zone so that there can be cheap manufacturing that they can send into Europe. I mean, it's an anti-EU thing. In the end, it's not going to create any more jobs. It'll just steal jobs from around the rest of Britain. But it shows the kind of mentality that people like Sunak, and who is a libertarian, the kind of libertarian wing of the Tories are in. It's a kind of smash and grab, get rid of all tax, all regulation, and we'll take the profits. Thank you, ma'am. So I think we're in very, very dangerous ground, and that's no wonder, therefore, that people in Scotland are reacting by saying we want none of this.
Well, we move on now, and EU member states regard the UK as unreliable, unpredictable, and untrustworthy, according to a new expert report. In a paper on EU views of the UK and the future relationship between the two, the Edinburgh-based Scottish Centre on European Relations concluded the UK's reputation has been badly damaged by Brexit. And it found there is a broad openness to Scotland having a normal accession path to the EU as an independent nation, as long as that follows a constitutionally sound referendum carried out in agreement between London and Edinburgh. and there is much less openness to the UK rejoining the EU even after a decade, SCER found. Sources told SCER a decade would be too soon, and the loss of trust over the Internal Market Bill, which contains clauses which renege on the 2019 withdrawal agreement, is so profound that many now question whether the UK can be trusted when it signs future deals. The Tory government's handling of the Brexit process has caused surprise and dismay in the bloc, it is said, with some now believing that the UK does not know what it wants, only what it does not want, with much of the confusion seen to be driven by internal divisions within the Conservative Party. Meanwhile, Boris Johnson's Global Britain concept is said to have left European leaders bemused. So, Alison, we have kind of known this for a while. The mood music coming out of Brussels and the other and other European capitals has changed a lot since the Brexit vote with regard to independence. Do you foresee the EU being actively friendly, or just sort of quietly sitting by and waiting for Scotland's independence to happen?
I think the tone has changed because the UK will become a third country. It's not a member state. And that changes the conversation a lot. But if you look at it just in a completely objective view, why wouldn't they want Scotland? Scotland has got a lot to offer. We've got a lot of resources. We're surplus in so many valuable resources like water, like electricity. 25% of the potential renewables in Europe. So we've got a lot to offer. So just from a purely pragmatic point of view, I think that there's that. I think there's been a lot of work done over many years building relationships, whereas the UK tends to do deals with people. And I think relationships are what sustains. So I do think there will be a warm conversation, but I do think also that if we are truly to look at self-determination, everything has to be the decision of the people of Scotland. Scotland did vote 62% to remain, and I think there's many options to be looked at in once we are an independent country as to what our relationship with the rest of the world is. And I think it's an exceptionally exciting time to look at what that potential is for Scotland and for our relationships elsewhere. I think there's lots to be learned from our northern neighbours in the Nordic nations as well. So, yeah, it's definitely a conversation that's changed the tone, and the UK really has no one to blame but themselves for the way they've approached Brexit from the get-go and all the way through.
Mm. Yeah, the mood music from the EU has not been good. Michel Barnier told David Frost, the UK's chief negotiator, yesterday that the EU could pull out of the talks within the next 48 hours if the UK isn't prepared to make some compromises. George, do you think that's likely, or do you think that's a wee bit of bluff to try and push the UK to make some sort of concessions?
Well, I think both sides are bluffing. It's been my view that the trade is so interconnected that neither side really wants to lose the opportunity for a trade agreement. So they might well, agree to 99% and see if they can leave a bit to the side. But for it to go to a collapse in the trade talks would be devastating. It would mean that we would revert, Britain and the EU both, would revert to World Trade Organization rules, which would mean tariffs on both sides. And I think that would be chaotic, particularly for instance, the car industry, which is very heavily interconnected across Europe, and the aircraft manufacturing industry. Not to mention the fact that Kent would become one vast car park as the lorries stacked up. I'm still guessing now. Things can go wrong. I mean, with people like Boris, anything can go wrong. You could say the wrong word, and the whole thing could collapse in a heap. But I think the likelihood, I would guess, is that there's a last minute agreement, and what it will come down to, though, is some kind of deal on fishing and on state aid rules. Those are the two sticking points. because they agreed most other things. Fishing, well, what could they do? They could agree roughly the status quo, but just do it every year, so that Britain could still pull out of letting EU fishing boats into British, basically Scottish territorial waters. The state aid rules, they could fudge them. Though, I mean, I personally think, I'm resistant to state aid rules because that's one of the things that's sunk BIFAB. But my guess, still there'll be a last minute deal. It could still all go wrong, could all go pear shaped, but I think both sides need to pull something together to keep the wheels of manufacturing and trade going.
Well, George, it is your optimism on this that sustains me. So we will have to just wait and see, and I'm sure we'll have you back to discuss it if and when a result does get negotiated. But we move on now.
My hat.
We move on now, and Health Secretary Jeane Freeman has announced plans for a significant expansion in testing for hospital patients, health and social care staff, and communities in level 4 areas. From next week, all emergency admissions to hospitals will be tested for COVID, and twice-weekly lateral flow testing will be introduced for all patient-facing healthcare staff working in hospitals. COVID-19 assessment centres and the Scottish Ambulance Service. Testing will be introduced for all elective admissions to hospital from mid-December. In the social care sector, testing will be expanded over the coming months for designated visitors, visiting professional staff and care at home workers. Visitor testing will be initially introduced in up to 12 care homes across 4 local authority areas from the 7th of December, with full rollout planned for January. To facilitate Christmas visiting in all care homes, PCR testing will be provided for those that do not have access to lateral flow testing by that time, with guidance on visiting arrangements over Christmas to be published shortly. Testing for the other 2 social care groups will also commence in January. December will also see the start of a testing programme for students before they return home for Christmas, and targeted geographic testing trialled in communities covered by NHS Ayrshire and Arran, Forth Valley and Greater Glasgow and Clyde, which are all currently under level 4 restrictions. Alison, I'll come to you first on this. The Greens, for example, have been calling for expanded asymptomatic testing, which is the kind of thing they're looking at in these level 4 areas, as well as more regular testing for health and social care staff. Do you think this is enough? Is this soon enough? Should this have been something that happened months ago, or has the Scottish Government got things right here?
I think in an ideal world, things would have moved quicker. But, I obviously am party to knowing what the kind of constraints were, whether it's availability in testing, kits and stuff. But I mean, to me, there seems to be some kind of creative ideas that have been done in other countries to test wastewater, particularly in houses of multiple dwelling, like student accommodation, to try and narrow down and keep track on the prevalence of COVID virus. But I've actually got personal experience in the care sector because my mum's actually in a care home, and I know families of those in residential care, whether it be geriatric or adults with incapacity or children and adults with disabilities who are in residential care. I think one of the lessons learned to me is that, particularly when we've got the private sector involved in social care, you need not guidance, you need protocol, you need very clear instructions so that it's done consistently. Because even without COVID, things are not always consistent, and which is why you've got things like the Care Commission and Scottish Care and different groups looking to try and get the standards across the board. But for this particular issue with testing, not visiting, the risk assessment on not visiting also has to be looked at, because there's a huge hit to welfare and mental health, and it's a really difficult time for people. I think hospitals, it's been clearer, of entry and exit points, and I know there's a lot of things to be learned from the experience of our fantastic Scottish Health Service, and how to look to keep running the NHS as well as managing the COVID crisis. For me, you would always manage an incident and manage the root cause analysis in parallel but separately. And I do think we're now at the stage that we've learned lots, and we need to really take that on board and see what we can do moving forward to continually improve what we're doing. But as I say, I don't want to criticise, because I'm not party to all the information of why certain decisions were made. But there's absolutely an appetite to move faster on this, and with a lot of clarity around testing, so that we can get safe visits. Nobody wants anybody to be in any level of danger. So if we can have the, visiting in a safe, as we can, risk-controlled environment, then the sooner the better for that, for everybody, for family and for the residents themselves.
Mm. Well, we move now from health and social care workers to unpaid carers, and carers are being urged to seek emotional and practical support through a new national campaign delivered in partnership with Still Games' Jane McCarry. Jane, who played Isa Drennan in the BBC Scotland sitcom, is a sandwich carer, meaning she cares for her mother while juggling childcare and work responsibilities. Jane marked the launch of the campaign by addressing carers from across Scotland at this year's Virtual Carers Parliament event. With more caution about going out, as well as services being under pressure because of the COVID pandemic, even more people have taken on a caring role. Before the pandemic, there were an estimated 690,000 carers in Scotland. However, recent polling by YouGov suggests this figure could have increased by an additional 390,000 during the pandemic and lockdown, taking the potential total number of carers in Scotland to around 1.1 million. The campaign aims to make sure that all who are new to caring, as well as those who were before, are aware there is support out there for them and that they can come forward to access it. So, George, coming to you on this, unpaid carers, of course, are one of the most valuable groups in society, and yet they are paid nothing or paid very little through the benefit system. This kind of support is really necessary, especially when, as we said there's been this big rise in people with caring responsibilities to handle, isn't it?
Yes, the economics have been fairly clear for almost a generation now. As the society ages across the Western world, caring responsibilities fall, more and more to relatives, to friends. This is not something that's going away. It's actually at some point, most of us are going to end up having to do some caring. And at the moment, it's just, it's society's getting this for free. And at the cost of, mental health problems for the carers, cost to the economy, because people have to take time off work to, quite rightly, to look after their loved ones. So we need, a central plan. It's not tinkering, a few extra benefits, and we need a fundamental rethink about how we're doing this caring. And it will involve things like reducing the work week. With ready discussions all across a lot of interested groups and Scottish Government about having a 4-day working week. I think the fundamental, it's not just about money, it's a fundamental transformation about how we look after ourselves and how we organise ourselves. And I think, come independence, that's going to be one of the big tasks that the incoming first government after freedom is going to have to put its mind to.
Well, we can discuss that perhaps a bit closer to the time, but we move on now to more immediate concerns. Students travelling home at the end of term will be able to take voluntary coronavirus tests through their college or university starting from next Monday. As part of a number of measures to support a safe return home, students are also being asked to take extra care in the period leading up to their departure, only going out for essential purposes such as learning, exercise and food shopping. This is to minimise the number of contacts they have with others and reduce the potential for the spread of the virus. Updated guidance has now been published for students on minimising social contact, testing and end-of-term travel, whether to other parts of Scotland, the UK or the world. So this is something, obviously, that going back to university was a problem at first. People all suddenly pushed into halls of residence, and there was a few wee outbreaks at various universities. They do seem to be doing well now, though, but obviously we don't want people then taking the virus back home. Do you think the Scottish Government has got this right, Alison?
Again, it's a very challenging situation that nobody wants to be in. But the young people are probably more likely to be asymptomatic as well, which is why I kind of refer back to my previous point about maybe testing wastewater, trying to get a level of confidence in
Mm.
an area before you look at targeting that testing, because if there's so many things that are kind of voluntary or kind of be seen to be loopholes, how robust is it going to be in achieving the aim of trying to reduce the spread of the virus? And it is a balancing act. The whole thing is it's all compromise. There's no right answers. There's not really wrong answers. It's like people trying to do, the Scottish Government and ministers trying to do the best balanced solution. But I do worry if there's no clarity, people will. If we don't make it easy for people to do the right thing, then the tendency will be for people to do the wrong thing. And young people have suffered a lot in this, as many parts of our country, our demographic have. And I think it is really difficult when we're saying do not go home. And then I'm a bit unclear, and I haven't actually, to be fair, I haven't actually seen today if we've clarified this, but the travel ban being lifted over the 5 days, does that mean if people just wait till then, they can just travel without a test? It's
Mm.
things like that I need a lot of clarity on. And I always think it's better if you've got something that you want people to follow. The process has to be very simple and very easy to understand and follow, which is why emergency services is dial 999, and then
Hmm.
you triage forward, because you can't afford people to get that process wrong. And I think we need to move more to that mindset of, if something's really important, we have to really put clarity into the process to make sure it's easy for people to do the right thing.
Hmm. So, George, young people have been accused of a lot of misbehavior during this pandemic. It's been, parties and whatnot that people have pinpointed as a problem in during lockdown. But in actual fact, especially for students, this has been a really, really challenging year, and most of them have done an admirable job holding it together, haven't they?
Absolutely. I think blaming young people for this pandemic and the spread of the virus is nonsense. Now, we have a very peculiar university funding model at the moment, and property market funding model at the moment. We've built vast numbers of student flats which we don't need. They're cheap to make. The students actually live in rabbit hutches, and they don't require car parking. So the result is that vast sums of money investment has gone into student flats, and if the students don't go to the flat and pay the rent, then the property market falls apart, and we've got problems for the banks who put up all the money for this. So, I mean, let's look behind the real reasons why students were sent back to
Mm.
university. A lot of that to do wasn't just to do with education; it was to do with the mechanics of how property works. Now, we could not let students go home for Christmas. I mean, that would have been silly. I worry that we're going to repeat the problem, that having sent them home, we're going to send them back to the universities and just compound the problem of spreading the virus before we've got to the stage of being able to vaccinate. I think maybe we should be thinking very carefully about letting a lot of students, once they get back home, stay there and running their courses virtually. There are some courses that need equipment, lab equipment, you probably have to do in real time, but there's lots of stuff you can read a book and go on Zoom. And I
Mm.
think until we've got the vaccine really out there by the spring, it might be better to skip term altogether.
Mm. Well, we move across the Atlantic now, and President elect Joe Biden is expected to nominate former Federal Reserve Chair Janet Yellen as US Treasury Secretary, making her the first woman to hold the key role and putting a seasoned economist and labour market expert in charge of leading the country out of the steepest downturn since the Great Depression. The move, confirmed by Democratic allies to the Biden campaign, will shift the Treasury's focus heavily towards progressive efforts to tackle growing economic inequality and fighting climate change, and away from the Trump administration's pre-pandemic emphasis on cutting taxes and easing financial regulations. Yellen, who is 74, brings Biden decades of economic policy experience and is respected by Congress, international finance officials, progressives, and business interests alike. She has called for opening fiscal spending taps to revive an economy racked by the coronavirus pandemic, and would be the first person to head the Treasury, the Fed, and the White House Council of Economic Advisers. The post will present a host of new challenges for Yellen, whose policy-making experience over the past 20 years has largely centred on monetary rather than fiscal policy. For one, it means a far more political role than that she played in her long career at the Fed, an institution that goes to great lengths to distance itself from partisan politics. So, Allison, first of all, in 200 and some odd years, the first woman Treasury Secretary and the first female Vice President in history in the one term. I mean, this isn't obviously the only thing that matters to the Biden administration, but it is quite a big step, isn't it?
Well, it is in one sense, but there's also a sense that the right person for the job, as was Kamala Harris, and I think when that no longer becomes a thing, that's when we have got a more balanced, representative, administration. Whatever side of the Atlantic it's on, and I think it absolutely has got a see it to be it element of young women and girls looking and saying, well, what glass ceiling? That's really what you want to see for your kids. I've got a daughter myself who's 10, who lives, has only really known in her kind of memory of knowing Nicola Sturgeon as our First Minister. So I think things like that are very important as to kind of break down these barriers. But I would say she's clearly got massive amounts of experience, and it will be a more political role. So it's interesting because you will get a kind of more political voice there, as obviously with Kamala Harris as the Vice President. But it's amazing how things just that seem, impossible suddenly become the norm. And I think that is the very interesting thing with change. Things are changing very quickly in the world now, and things. Who knew we would have a game? Reality TV star as the president. Then it happened. So I think we're in a way it seems like glass ceilings have been broken. In another way, we're kind of going back to serious politicians and serious people doing serious jobs. So I think there's definitely a kind of an element there to be applauded that we've got the right people for the job, and it'll be up to her to demonstrate that.
And as we see Biden's team starting to take shape, we've also seen the Trump administration take the first steps to enabling the transition to happen. Do you expect that Trump's protests about this, Trump's election denial, is going to just putter out at this stage, or do you think he will keep fighting right up until the last minute?
Who knows? Who knows with Trump? I mean, I think, he is really in danger of, if he's not already, of defining, as bad as it was, of really defining his presidency with how he was basically huckled at the door, kind of thing at the end, because it's just becoming really embarrassing. It's like a farce upon farce at the moment, and I think even satirists are scratching their head to work out how they could make satire any more bizarre than reality at the moment in the kind of situation there. So I think if he's got anybody advising him, I'm sure there'll be an angle that comes out that it was his decision in the first place. Who knows? It'll all be fake news in the end. But it's all just been. It's not even entertaining anymore. It's just really embarrassing to watch, to be honest.
And George, to turn to you, obviously a majority of the senior cabinet roles have to be approved by the Senate, including obviously the Treasury Secretary, which does limit Biden's options a wee bit. He has to think about getting some of these picks past a Republican-dominated Senate. Do you think that will affect the kind of policies that he's ultimately able to enact?
Absolutely. I mean, people shouldn't get overexcited about Biden or Janet Yellen. I mean, Janet Yellen and Biden, they're both dyed-in-the-wool neoliberals. I mean, yeah, move jobs wherever it's cheapest, slash tax. I mean, Trump was a mad populist to try to bring jobs home to America. He was fighting globalism, and all has happened, ladies and gentlemen, is not some nice liberals have come in to the White House to make the world nicer for all of us. These are dyed-in-the-wool neoliberals who are going to drive the world back to where it was, getting jobs, to the poorest parts of the world to pay the cheapest wages, to mass the profits in the big US high tech companies. And Janet Yellen is a safe pair of hands. And I disagree with you that she's not political. Of course, she's political. She just represents a different wing of American capitalism from Biden. Now, will Biden have to play ball with the Senate to get his picks accepted? Yes, which is why, of course, he's gone even now for very conservative people, old style conservatives, and why he's actually opened up a fight against the left wing of the Democratic Party and the people who got him elected. And one of the first things he's done is to announce that he's not going to change Trump's decision to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. So there's 50 years of American policy down the drain. I mean, let's be very careful here. The change is in style, not substance.
Well, speaking of change, we come back to Scotland, and a new umbrella body bringing together local pro-independence groups across Scotland has been launched. The National Yes Network grew out of the cooperative model developed by Yes Highlands and Islands. It has stated that its core function is to create connections within and across the regions of our nation, which both harness the power of a cohesive movement, whilst retaining the autonomy of local groups and building on their connections with their own communities, reflecting their needs, wants and aspirations. Invitations have been extended to any Yes group in the country which wishes to join, and so far groups from as far north as Orkney all the way down to Selkirk are already involved. Anyone wishing to get involved or just hoping to learn more about the organisation can reach them by email at info@nationalyesnetwork.scot. And Allison, this is one of the reasons that we've invited you on tonight, because you've been involved in setting this network up. So tell us a wee bit about how you got involved and why you felt this network was necessary.
Okay, well, firstly, just to reiterate, it's not an umbrella, it's a network. And there's a clear difference that we're not aiming to be an overarching. It's about connecting what's already there, because independence movement hasn't gone away in 6 years since the referendum. It might not have been active everywhere. It's been active in a lot of places, and a lot of that action has turned to community support, and there's been some incredible work done. But there's been other stuff done as well that's just not surfaced to be recognised more regionally or nationally, and that is really what we hope to have learned and press the reset button from our experiences with lockdown in supporting our communities, because many of our community activists are the same people that campaign for independence, campaign for various independent political parties like myself, and our communities recognise that. So what we had, the Zoom can be very difficult, and I'm sure there's a term called Zoom fatigue, because I'm sure I have it half the time, but the positives of this are that we can have meetings with people in Orkney and Shetland. One of the meetings, somebody was from Shetland, and meeting people in the borders, the Western Isles, Edinburgh, Glasgow, without that travel. I mean, I live rurally, and travel is a big impact when you've got to go to meetings, particularly in the winter, particularly in the dark nights, and it is a barrier to people. So let's look at one of the upsides, that we've been able to get together and let's share experiences. You mentioned Yes Highlands and Islands. They've got a very established network. So Alison Fraser from Inver Yes, and Sharon Trish from Perth for Independence Network, and Peter Winfield from Marchment and Morningside got together to say, how can we expand out all this great work that Yes Highlands and Islands are doing in one of the most challenging areas, because it's very diverse geographically, and they've had fantastic success connecting. So on that principle, we brought people together, or those guys brought people together, including myself from Stirlingshire, and we've looked at what we've got, our own personal connections that we've made over the years, whether it's through marches and rallies, that we have stalls at a lot of things through our group, Butterflies Rising, and we've made loads of friends and connections, and it's leveraging that and pulling it all together to create this network map across Scotland, so that it's an enabler for campaigning. It's an enabler for sharing ideas, sharing best practice, sharing resources, so that we can work smarter the next time. Because I think we've learned lots from our experience in the last referendum from 2012, when some of the groups started. Some of the groups didn't start until after the referendum, but and new groups will still arise, and that's fantastic. I think the more doors, entry points with no barriers into this network, the better. We're not there to compete with anybody else. We're there to work kind of symbiotically and add a value proposition into the independence movement, because I think the gap that's been missing is the connection, because at the end of the day, it's the people who do the work, it's the people that do the convincing to their family, friends, communities, neighbours, and the more that we can bring people together, so that we don't have two groups in villages 15 miles down the road that didn't actually know each other existed. So I think this is one of the absolute value propositions in that connection and sense of community. And Catalonia is often talked about how these folks can get 1 million people on the streets, and it's wonderful. And I think I know George knows lots about Catalonia, but we're trying to not copy that, but the principle of community, because it's not just about what we've learned in practice from the COVID situation and lockdown and how to practically support our communities. So we've learned from that, but this is also something that will take us beyond independence. This is looking at how we really bring democracy as close to people as possible, because if we do that, the more they engage. So it's great having fantastic polls, moving people towards independence. That's a kind of national swing confidence based on a lot of things. A lot of people say, look, first ministers, consistency and presence and talking to people like adults. We've filled a lot of the bucket with confidence there, but we need to make sure not only is there no holes in the bottom of the bucket that leak people out, but also that we harness the energy created there to do something meaningful and be there and active and able to respond when we need to. And I think that agility and flexibility is going to be critical in the next campaign.
Well, we do hope to hear from you again as the network develops again. If anybody is interested in getting their group signed up to that, it's info@nationalyesnetwork.scot. Now, that was our last big story for this evening, but there are a couple of other things we did want to mention. Today is the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. We've been talking obviously a lot about the pandemic that the coronavirus has inflicted on us, but the violence against women is a pandemic that has been going on for decades, if not centuries, if not millennia. And it still probably kills, traumatizes, injures more women than the coronavirus will ever touch. I guess, Allison, just quickly, do you have any thoughts on today and what we should be thinking about today?
Yeah, I mean, I think these days are always good to raise that awareness, but it shouldn't be one day. It should be a cultural change, a societal change, a lack of acceptance for this. And too often these things go unreported. It becomes the kind of almost like the acceptable, norm, and it's not acceptable. It's not acceptable in this part of the world. It's not acceptable in any part of the world. And I think it's really important to build that confidence. And again, I keep coming back to community. That's kind of what I'm all about, kind of community empowerment and community support. And I think we really do need to work across all our communities and, across the country in making, violence against women, girls, anyone, unacceptable. And, particularly when there's, groups that are either underrepresented or feel they don't have a voice, it's so important to let them know that it's not acceptable and they will get support. and there are other ways. And yeah, it's a complex issue and it's multi-layered, but these days are great to put a spotlight on, but it needs to be a constant focus on tackling the problem, really understanding what the problem is we're trying to solve, and bringing all the necessary tools to bear on really getting to the bottom of this, to say that this is just not acceptable. It's not good enough to have a culture that accepts this.
Yeah. And George, obviously the vast majority of violence against women is done by men. So how do we take responsibility for that, and how do we raise a new generation of men that are going to break this cycle?
I think one of the important things to remember is that violence against women in the home is not in one particular class.
Mm.
It happens right across all the classes. It's likely to happen in a middle class home as much as a working class home. And I think we have something, particularly men and male politicians have stereotypes about the nature of where this violence happens. It's something endemic throughout all of society, and a lot of it results from, don't want to simplify too much, but I mean, the way our economic system works is it still leaves to women much of the role of looking after the household, bringing up the children. It's just that in modern times they have to go out and work as well. So we're forced on women, as a result of the nature of the society that we live in, roles which should actually be shared by all of society. There are no quick fixes unless we change society as it is. I was very lucky, back in the 1990s, I was a member of Edinburgh Council. And it was Edinburgh Council in the 1990s that first came up with the zero tolerance campaign against violence against women. The men on the council thought, oh, it's a nice idea, but it's kind of, it's just another thing we do. Looking back on it, in that period in the 1990s, the most important campaign that Edinburgh Council ran, that I was part of, was a zero tolerance campaign. It went around the world. And it's sad to me, 30 years on, we still haven't made that much progress. So yes, this is a day where we think about the problem, but we don't think about it today and then forget about it tomorrow. Until we have resolved the problem of violence and oppression against women, we haven't solved anything on this earth.
Absolutely. And we did also just want to mention that Diego Maradona, legendary Argentinian footballer, also died today at the age of 60. He's perhaps most notorious in the UK for the Hand of God goal against England back in, 1986? But I think he should be remembered more for the second goal in that game, which was almost Archie Gemmill-esque in its brilliance. It's well worth looking up on YouTube if you want to remember just what a genius Diego Maradona was. But that is all we have time for tonight. So thank you very much to George Kerrivan and to Allison Graham. And thank you to you at home for joining us as well. There would be no point in these shows without you. But we do have to ask for your support. As you know, we have been running a crowdfunder, and we're just going to show you a wee video about that just now.
The Catalans, the Basques, the Galicians in the Basque.
An independent future for Scotland.
How quickly do you think a referendum can be arranged?
Best practice demands that it should be 6 months.
Just looking at the overall share numbers for Scotland at the moment, the SNP 46.4%. So yeah, that is our crowdfunder. We're aiming to raise £100,000 with the goal of employing a full-time editor for the shows and 3 full-time, or the equivalent in part-time journalists posts as well. We really want to develop as a news broadcaster. So if you're able to help with that, please do. Go to broadcastingscotland.scot/donate if you just want to make a one-off donation, or if you'd like to become a regular supporter, then you can go to broadcastingscotland.scot/register and you can sign up there as a supporter. We're making a regular donation. As we said, though, there is a lot of work to be done going forward. And if you'd like to get involved here at Broadcasting Scotland as a volunteer, there are going to be other jobs that we can't pay for. So if you'd like to get involved, then do please get in touch with us. We have lots of opportunities here, lots of training we can provide. So do please get in touch. And finally, please do spread the word about Broadcasting Scotland. We're not planning to spend much, if any, of that money we're trying to raise on marketing. We do rely on you to do a lot of that for us. So do please follow us on Twitter at BroadcastScot, like our Facebook page, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and then share the shows around with people. Let them know why you support Broadcasting Scotland, and hopefully you can encourage them to give us a try as well. But that is absolutely all we have time for tonight. So thank you once again to George Caravan and to Allison Graham. It's been a pleasure to have both of you on the show. I'll be back on Friday at 7. Gordon will be back tomorrow at 7. But until then, thank you very much for joining us and have a great evening. Good night.